My name is Stephen. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in environments where composure matters more than volume, offices where credibility is currency, and where the quiet people are often mistaken for the least dangerous ones. If you asked the people I worked with back then to describe me, they would have used words like steady, dependable, maybe reserved. Some might have said I lacked ambition. Others would have assumed I was comfortable being in the background. I rarely corrected them, not because they were right, but because correcting perceptions has never been my instinct. This story isn't about a dramatic downfall or a triumphant revenge. It's about a slow realization, about what happens when trust is quietly weaponized, and when loyalty, real loyalty, is mistaken for weakness. A few years ago, anonymous letters began circulating. Not online, not publicly. They were sent to the right desks, at the right times, containing the kind of accusations that don't explode immediately, but seep. Letters accusing me of bribery, of ethical shortcuts, of things that, if proven, could end a career built carefully over more than a decade. At first I thought it was a mistake. Then I thought it was someone who didn't know me. Then I thought it was someone who did. What unsettled me wasn't just the content of the letters. It was the precision. The timing matched conversations I'd had in private. The details referenced meetings that only a handful of people knew about. And the handwriting, subtle quirks most people would miss, began to feel familiar in a way that made my stomach tighten. This is a story about how I realized the person behind those letters wasn't an enemy in the shadows, but the colleague I trusted most. The one who sat across from me. The one who knew my routines, my blind spots, my sense of fairness. The one who understood exactly how to hurt me without ever raising their voice. I won't dramatize what follows. I won't exaggerate conversations or turn people into caricatures. There was no shouting match, no public humiliation, no cinematic moment where everyone suddenly clapped or apologized. Real life doesn't work that way. What did happen was quieter and more irreversible. This is a story about observation, about restraint, about choosing when not to speak, and about how psychological reversals rarely look like victories from the outside, but feel unmistakable on the inside. I'm sharing this not to warn you about betrayal in general, or to suggest you should distrust everyone close to you. I'm sharing it because many of us have experienced moments where something felt off, but we convinced ourselves to ignore it. Moments where loyalty asked too much, and silence cost more than words. If you've ever wondered whether staying calm in the face of quiet injustice actually matters, this story might resonate with you. So before we go any further, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever looked back at a moment and realized you understood the truth long before you were ready to accept it? Before any letters appeared, before suspicion had a shape or a name, I already occupied a very specific place in that office ecosystem. I was the one people trusted with follow-through, not flash. The person whose name came up when something needed to be handled carefully, quietly, without supervision. I didn't fight for attention in meetings. I didn't interrupt. I didn't sell myself loudly. Over time, that restraint became my label. Reliable, safe, predictable. Not weak, just invisible in the way that makes people forget you're paying attention. I arrived early most days, not because I wanted to be seen, but because I liked starting before the noise. I knew which emails to answer immediately and which ones to let breathe. I kept notes, not because I was paranoid, but because I respected accuracy. I had watched too many careers wobble on misremembered conversations. To my colleagues, I was useful in a way that didn't threaten anyone. I didn't challenge authority publicly. I didn't compete for spotlight projects. I wasn't angling for leadership in a way that made others defensive. And because of that, people felt comfortable around me. Comfortable enough to speak freely. Comfortable enough to vent. Comfortable enough to forget that being quiet doesn't mean being absent. My closest colleague, let's call him Daniel, was the opposite of me in all the visible ways. He was articulate, confident, and good at framing ideas in ways that landed well with leadership. Where I specialized in systems and structure, he specialized in narrative. Together on paper, we looked like a balanced team, and for a long time, I believed that was true. Daniel often joked that I was the anchor, the one who made sure things didn't drift. He said it kindly. Others echoed it. I accepted the role without question. Every group unconsciously assigns one, and I didn't resent it. What I didn't notice, at least not consciously, was how that role came with assumptions. Anchors don't move first. Anchors don't surprise people. Anchors stay where they're dropped. When projects succeeded, Daniel spoke. When they required explanation, I clarified. When something went wrong, I absorbed the weight without dramatizing it. Not because I was asked to, but because it felt efficient. Over time, that pattern calcified. In meetings, my suggestions were often met with nods rather than discussion. Not disagreement, just closure. As if what I said didn't require further thought. If Daniel rephrased the same idea minutes later, it suddenly sparked conversation. I noticed, I logged it mentally, but I didn't challenge it, because challenging it would have meant changing how people saw me. And at the time, that didn't feel necessary. There's a strange safety in being underestimated. People don't guard their words. They don't consider how information might be used. They don't imagine you as a variable. I lived there for years. Even leadership treated me like infrastructure rather than initiative. I was consulted, trusted, leaned on, but rarely scrutinized. Performance reviews praised my consistency, my ethics, and my steady presence. Promotions hovered but never quite landed. And I told myself that was fine, because I believed the real value of my work wasn't visibility, it was integrity. So when the first anonymous letter arrived months later, accusing me of something so far outside my character, the reason it hurt wasn't fear. It was confusion. I had spent years being careful. Not secretive. Careful. I believed that counted for something, that people could feel the difference. What I didn't yet understand was that being seen as harmless makes you the easiest target for someone who needs a convincing story. At that stage, though, I still thought of myself as who they thought I was. The reliable one, the quiet one, the person who didn't make waves. I didn't know yet that roles can be reassigned without your consent. And I didn't know that the person who benefited most from my invisibility had been watching it just as closely as I had. The first moment that stands out didn't feel important at the time. That's the thing about early warnings. They rarely announce themselves. They arrive as interruptions you explain away, small enough to ignore without guilt. It happened during a routine project review. Nothing high stakes, just a cross-team meeting where we were walking leadership through timelines and compliance checkpoints. I had prepared the documentation, cross-verified figures, and flagged one potential risk area that hadn't been addressed yet. When my turn came, I spoke plainly, no dramatics, just facts. Daniel cut in halfway through my sentence. Not aggressively, not rudely. He smiled as he did it, like someone helping you finish a thought you're struggling to articulate. He reframed what I'd just said, trimming out the risk and emphasizing progress instead. The room nodded. No one looked back at me. It was subtle, so subtle that calling it out would have felt awkward, maybe even petty. And that's exactly why it worked. I remember sitting there, hands folded, listening to my own analysis delivered back to the room with a softer edge. Less caution, more optimism. Leadership smiled, notes were taken, the meeting moved on. Afterward, Daniel clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Good catch earlier. Didn't want them to overthink it, though." I nodded. That was the first small cut. Not because my idea was dismissed, but because it was redirected without acknowledgement. As if my role was to surface information, not shape how it was understood. I told myself it didn't matter. The outcome was the same. The team looked competent. The project stayed on track. Still, something lingered. Over the next few weeks, similar moments repeated. A comment made in passing that got reattributed. A concern I raised privately resurfaced publicly without my name attached. A decision I had been careful about was suddenly framed as overly cautious. None of it rose to the level of confrontation. And that's what made it difficult to respond to. If I said something, I'd sound defensive. If I didn't, the pattern continued. So I chose silence. I rationalized it the same way many people do. This is just how collaboration works. Not everything needs credit. Results matter more than recognition. And to be fair, that belief had guided me well for years. But this felt different. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation in the break area. Daniel was speaking with a senior manager about our workflow. I wasn't meant to hear it. I hadn't announced myself yet. He said, "Stephen's great with details, but sometimes you have to translate things upward. He tends to get lost in the weeds." The manager chuckled. "Yeah, but that's why you're here." I stepped into view a second later. Both of them turned, smiles, normalcy restored. No one apologized. No one corrected anything. And I didn't react. But something shifted internally. Not anger, not hurt. Awareness. I started replaying past conversations with a different lens. Not looking for offense, but for positioning. Who was framing whom? Who benefited from certain narratives? And I noticed something else. Daniel had begun asking more questions than before. Not about the work in general, but about my processes. How I kept records I spoke to directly. Which compliance reviews did I handle personally? At the time, I interpreted it as interest. Trust, even. We were close colleagues. Sharing workflows was normal. Still, I answered carefully. Not evasively, but precisely. I had no proof of anything. No accusation to make. Just a growing sense that my role was being defined for me in ways that didn't match reality. The first anonymous letter hadn't arrived yet. My name hadn't been linked to anything improper. From the outside, everything looked stable. But that's often when the ground starts to move. The first small cut isn't meant to wound. It's meant to test how much you'll tolerate without responding. And I had just shown how high that tolerance was. Disrespect rarely arrives fully formed. It grows the way habits do. Through repetition, through the absence of resistance, through the quiet relief of realizing no one is stopping you. After that first interruption, the pattern settled in. Not dramatically, not daily, just often enough to become familiar. Daniel began to position himself as the interpreter of my work. In meetings, he'd preface my contributions with context, as if translating from a language the room didn't quite speak. What Stephen means here is, or to simplify what Stephen's getting at, each time he smiled. Each time the room relaxed. And each time something was taken from me that didn't show up on any report. I noticed that when I spoke first, the discussion ended sooner. When Daniel spoke first, the discussion expanded. Leadership asked follow-up questions. People leaned forward. When I clarified something he'd already summarized, it felt redundant, even if the substance was different. I could have pushed back. I could have said, "Actually, that's not quite what I meant." I could have reframed my points more forcefully. I could have claimed space, but I didn't, because the cost of doing so in that environment felt higher than the cost of staying quiet. I told myself I was being professional. That ego didn't matter. As long as the work was solid, perception would eventually correct itself. That's one of the most comforting lies quiet people tell themselves. The truth is, perception rarely self-corrects. It settles where it's fed. Outside of meetings, the dynamic seeped into smaller interactions. Daniel started looping me in after decisions were already made. He'd phrase it as efficiency. "I knew you'd agree, so I went ahead." When I raised concerns, he'd respond with reassurance rather than discussion. "I get where you're coming from, but trust me, it'll be fine." And because things did turn out fine, at least on the surface, I learned to swallow the discomfort. What made it harder to address was how reasonable it all looked from the outside. There was no insult, no raised voice, no obvious undermining, just a gradual shift in who was seen as the authority and who was seen as support. And I was complicit. Every time I let it slide, I reinforced the role they were assigning me. Reliable, useful, quiet, invisible. I began to notice how others mirrored Daniel's behavior. Colleagues would summarize my points before I finished speaking. Some would even look to Daniel for confirmation after I spoke, as if checking whether my input had been approved. I laughed it off, made myself smaller in ways that felt strategic at the time. Inside, though, I was tracking something else. I started paying closer attention to language, not just what was said, but how it was framed. Who introduced ideas? Who validated them? Who absorbed blame when something stalled? And I realized something unsettling. Daniel wasn't just benefiting from the dynamic. He was shaping it. He had learned exactly how far he could go without triggering resistance. Exactly how to present himself as indispensable while positioning me as a specialist who needed guidance. And the more that narrative settled, the harder it would be to reverse. Still, I didn't confront him, not because I was afraid, but because confrontation requires clarity. And at that point, all I had were patterns, not proof. Then the first anonymous letter arrived. It wasn't dramatic, no threats, no ultimatums, just a carefully worded note sent to compliance, raising concerns about my involvement in a vendor selection process months earlier. It cited dates, meeting times, a private conversation I'd had with Daniel about potential conflicts of interest, one I'd flagged myself. The accusation wasn't direct. It didn't say I had taken a bribe. It suggested the appearance of impropriety, enough to trigger a review, enough to plant doubt. When HR called me in, they were calm, procedural, almost apologetic. I answered every question clearly, provided documentation, explained context. I wasn't worried about the facts. What unsettled me was something else entirely. As I walked back to my desk afterward, Daniel looked up and said, "Everything okay?" His tone was concerned, supportive, exactly what you'd expect from a trusted colleague. I nodded and said yes, but for the first time, I didn't feel reassured by his concern, because the letter had known too much, and someone had grown very comfortable speaking for me. Once a role is assigned, people begin to interact with you as if it has always been yours. I didn't notice the moment it became official. There was no announcement, no conversation, just a subtle shift in how decisions flowed around me rather than through me. I was no longer consulted early. I was informed later, not excluded, but repositioned. When new initiatives came up, Daniel was asked for perspective. I was asked for validation. My function had narrowed. I was there to confirm, not to challenge, to support, not to steer. And I let it happen longer than I should have. Part of that was habit. Part of it was pride. I had always believed that integrity spoke for itself, that being right mattered more than being visible. But integrity doesn't speak. People do. I began to see how my reputation was being quietly rewritten, not as someone untrustworthy, but as someone limited, too cautious, too detailed, someone who needed interpretation. That framing mattered, because when the second anonymous letter arrived, the ground was already prepared. This one was sent to a different department. Still anonymous, still careful. It referenced a separate incident, again, one I had discussed privately with Daniel. Again, framed as concern rather than accusation. This time the review was longer. More people involved. More questions about judgment, not just facts. I noticed how the tone changed. No one accused me directly, but there was a shift in how they listened, as if weighing my words against an unspoken narrative. And that narrative wasn't coming from nowhere. I watched Daniel during those weeks, how he offered to help clarify processes for leadership, how he positioned himself as a bridge, how he spoke about risk management in ways that subtly distanced himself from me. He never said my name negatively. He didn't have to. The role had already been assigned. I was the technical one, the cautious one, the person who sometimes missed the bigger picture. And in that framework, anonymous concerns didn't sound implausible. That's what hurt. Not fear of consequences, but the realization that trust isn't just about character. It's about context. And my context had been shaped without my consent. I asked myself why I hadn't pushed back earlier, why I'd allowed my voice to be softened by someone else's. The honest answer was uncomfortable, because the role benefited me in small ways. It allowed me to avoid conflict. It let me focus on work rather than politics. It preserved a sense of moral high ground, but it also made me predictable, and predictability is leverage. Around that time, I stopped sharing as much. I still collaborated, still contributed, but I became more selective. I answered questions fully, but without volunteering extra context. Not defensively, deliberately. I began reviewing past communications, not obsessively, methodically, emails, meeting notes, timelines, patterns. And one thing became clear. Every anonymous concern traced back to information that had passed through one channel. Daniel, the realization didn't hit me like anger. It landed with clarity. If he wasn't the source, he was at least the conduit. And if he was the conduit, then the role he'd assigned me wasn't accidental. It was protective for him. Still, I didn't confront him, because confronting someone without certainty doesn't restore power. It gives it away. Instead, I accepted the role on the surface, reliable, quiet, in the background. But internally, something had changed. I was no longer trying to be understood. I was trying to understand, and that shift, subtle as it was, marked the end of who I had been to them. The shift didn't happen during a meeting, or a review, or even when the third letter arrived. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, in a moment so quiet it almost didn't register as important. I was alone in a small conference room, reviewing documentation for a compliance audit that had nothing to do with me directly. It was procedural, one of those tasks that exist to satisfy regulators, not to reveal truth. The room was empty except for the hum of the air system and the faint reflection of the city in the glass wall. I remember pausing mid-sentence as I read through an email chain from months earlier. It wasn't incriminating, it wasn't dramatic. It was edited, a forwarded message, one I recognized immediately. The language had been subtly reframed, not altered enough to be false, but enough to shift tone. Caution became uncertainty, due diligence became hesitant. And the sender was Daniel. I leaned back in the chair and felt something settle in my chest. Not anger, not fear, acceptance. Up until that moment, a part of me had still hoped there was an explanation that didn't involve intent. That this was a misunderstanding amplified by systems and stress. That Daniel was careless, not calculated. But this wasn't carelessness. This was curation. He had taken my words and reshaped how they would be read downstream, quietly, plausibly, in ways that aligned perfectly with the role he'd been assigning me. And suddenly, everything made sense. The interruptions, the summaries, the way concerns traveled without context. This wasn't betrayal in the dramatic sense. It was something colder. It was optimization. I closed the laptop and sat there longer than necessary, not thinking about what to do, but about what I would not do. I would not confront him emotionally. I would not warn him. I would not rush. Because the moment you reveal awareness, you lose your vantage point. That afternoon marked a line I didn't announce. From that point on, silence stopped being the default and became a choice. I continued to show up the same way, same tone, same reliability, same restraint. If anything, I became easier to work with. But internally, I stopped assuming goodwill. Instead, I assumed intent and tested it quietly. I paid closer attention to how information moved. Who received what? How quickly? Through whom? I began to notice delays, selective forwarding. Conversations are summarized differently depending on the audience. And most importantly, I noticed how Daniel reacted when I withheld something. A detail, a draft, a clarification. Nothing essential, just enough to observe behavior. He asked follow-up questions sooner than before. Pressed gently, framed it as a concern. Efficiency. It confirmed what I needed to know. That small conference room moment didn't harden me, it clarified me. I realized I had been operating under an outdated assumption that professionalism required transparency in all directions. That trust was a baseline. In reality, trust is contextual. And when someone begins using your openness as material, you adjust. That evening, I went home and opened my old leather notebook, the one I'd carried for years but rarely used anymore. I didn't write accusations, I wrote facts, dates, language shifts, who was present, what changed afterward. No conclusions, no emotion. Just a record, because if this was going where I suspected, emotion would only get in the way. That night, I slept well. Not because I felt safe, but because uncertainty had finally given way to direction. I didn't know yet how this would end. I didn't know how far Daniel had gone, or how exposed I truly was. But I knew one thing with certainty. I was no longer reacting. I was observing from a position of intent. And once that happens, the power dynamic begins to invert, quietly and without announcement. There's a difference between being silent because you don't know what to say, and being silent because you know exactly what not to say. Once that distinction became clear to me, everything slowed down. I stopped filling gaps in conversations, stopped offering preemptive explanations. When someone misunderstood my point, I let the misunderstanding sit long enough to see who corrected it and how. Most of the time, Daniel did. Not by asking me to clarify, but by reframing again. That told me more than any confession could. I began responding and writing more often than verbally. Emails instead of hallway conversations, summaries instead of improvisation. Not because I was afraid of being misquoted, but because I wanted a stable record of how my words existed before anyone touched them. Daniel noticed. He didn't comment directly. He never would. But his tone shifted. He became more complimentary in group settings, more deferential, as if recalibrating how close to the line he could operate without drawing attention. It confirmed something else. He was aware of perception. He just believed he controlled it. Silence, when chosen deliberately, does something interesting. It creates space. And in that space, other people revealed themselves. I watched how leadership interacted with me now that I spoke less. They leaned in when I did speak, asked me to expand. The dynamic began to rebalance, not because I asserted myself, but because absence made my presence more noticeable. Daniel, on the other hand, began to fill the space more aggressively. Longer explanations, more context, more narrative. Too much sometimes. I kept documenting, not obsessively, not with a sense of mission, just with consistency. Each anonymous letter followed the same pattern. A concern raised shortly after a private conversation, language that echoed Daniel's phrasing, timing that suggested anticipation rather than a reaction. Still, I didn't act, because acting too early would force the conflict into the open, where deniability thrives. Instead, I let the process continue. Compliance concluded their reviews without finding wrongdoing, but the shadow remained, and that shadow had weight. I felt it in meetings where my judgment was subtly double-checked, in decisions that required an extra sign-off, in the way certain conversations excluded me, not out of malice but caution, and Daniel positioned himself as the solution, helpful, calm, reassuring. He never once defended me directly. That too went into the notebook. Silence gave me something else. Time. Time to understand not just what was happening, but why. Daniel wasn't trying to destroy me, not exactly. He was insulating himself. There were projects he had influenced more than disclosed. Decisions he had shaped without documentation. By positioning me as the cautious one, the potential liability, he made himself look decisive by contrast. I was covered, and as long as I stayed predictable, the system worked. So I stayed predictable. I nodded, I agreed, I clarified when asked. But I stopped sharing early insights, stopped flagging risks informally, stopped being the safety net. And slowly, quietly, that absence began to matter. Decisions moved faster, but not better. Questions surfaced later. Issues took longer to resolve. And for the first time, Daniel didn't have me quietly stabilizing things behind the scenes. He didn't realize that yet. Silence had become a strategic position, not to punish, not to trap, but to observe the structure without holding it up. And when a structure is no longer supported, its weaknesses reveal themselves without accusation. I didn't need to push, I just needed to let go. What Daniel never noticed, what almost no one ever notices, is how much information passes through the hands of the person who isn't competing for attention. For when you're not posturing, people don't filter themselves. When you're not selling, people assume you're not collecting. For years, I had been the quiet constant in the room, the one copied on emails, just in case, the one asked to sanity check decisions before they moved forward, the one people spoke to casually, assuming the conversation would end there. They didn't realize that consistency creates memory. And memory, when paired with documentation, becomes leverage. I didn't suddenly start gathering evidence after my realization. I already had years of it. Meeting notes, email threads, version histories, audit trails. Not because I anticipated betrayal, but because accuracy had always mattered to me. What changed in part 6 was how deliberately I began connecting those fragments. I started mapping timelines, not just of the anonymous letters, but of what happened immediately before and after them. Which projects were under scrutiny? Which decisions had gone undocumented? Which conversations had Daniel pushed to be verbal rather than written? Patterns emerged quickly. Each letter coincided with a moment when scrutiny could have reasonably shifted toward Daniel's workstream. Each accusation redirected attention, subtly but effectively, toward my role as the cautious one, the process-heavy one, the potential bottleneck. I noticed how language traveled upward. When Daniel spoke to leadership, he used phrases like risk-averse, overly conservative, and procedural drag. Never attached to blame, just descriptors, reasonable ones. And because I rarely corrected those framings publicly, they calcified. What no one noticed was that I had begun quietly tightening my own process. I stopped informal approvals, started routing decisions through established channels, asked for written confirmation where verbal agreement used to suffice. Daniel found it irritating. He masked it well, but it showed in the way he'd sigh before responding to an email or joke about my paper trail tendencies. I smiled along, because every joke confirmed that the trail mattered. The breakthrough came when I cross-referenced handwriting samples. Not dramatically, not with forensic certainty, just habit. Daniel had a distinctive way of forming certain letters, an elongated T, a compressed R. I had seen it countless times on whiteboards, sticky notes, and margin comments. The anonymous letters were typed, but the envelopes weren't. I didn't jump to conclusions. I scanned and compared, slowly, methodically. It wasn't proof on its own, but combined with access, timing, and phrasing, and it narrowed the field to one. Still, I waited, because quiet dominance isn't about catching someone. It's about letting them finish building the case against themselves. I began to notice small inconsistencies in Daniel's explanations, minor contradictions between what he said to me and what he said to others. Nothing dramatic, just enough to log. And then there was the email, a forwarding error. He had meant to send the message to compliance. Instead, he sent it to me. It was brief, carefully worded, referencing a concern already under review, echoing language from the latest anonymous letter, almost verbatim. He recalled it within minutes, but not before I'd read it. I didn't respond. I didn't acknowledge it. I saved it. That was the moment preparation ended and positioning began. Because now, it wasn't just a pattern. It was a convergence. I reviewed my notebook that night, not with satisfaction, just with calm. I wasn't excited. I wasn't angry. I was resolved. The leverage I had wasn't explosive. It wouldn't destroy anyone overnight. It wouldn't make headlines. But it was precise. And precision matters more than spectacle. What Daniel never noticed was that while he was shaping perception, I was preserving reality. And reality, when timed correctly, doesn't need volume. It only needs to be undeniable. The moment of certainty didn't arrive with adrenaline. It arrived with stillness. I was at my desk late one evening, the office mostly empty, reviewing everything one last time. Not to convince myself, but to remove doubt. Doubt is dangerous when you're about to make a decision you can't undo. I laid it all out. The timelines, the phrasing overlaps, the forwarding error, the access points, the envelopes. Separately, each piece could be explained away. Together they formed something solid enough to stand on without leaning. And that's when I allowed myself to say it internally, without emotion. It was him, not as an accusation, as a conclusion. What surprised me wasn't the realization itself, but how little it changed how I felt about Daniel. There was no hatred, no rush of vindication, just a quiet understanding of who he was when incentives aligned a certain way. That understanding mattered more than any punishment ever could. I didn't tell anyone. Not HR, not leadership, not even a confidant, because the reveal wasn't meant to be public. It was meant to be private, a recalibration of how I would move from that point forward. Once you know the truth, you stop asking the wrong questions. Instead of, why would he do this? I asked, what does he need this to continue? The answer was simple. He needed me to be predictable. He needed me contained. He needed me unaware, or at least unresponsive. And now none of those conditions applied. I didn't rush to expose him because exposure would have triggered defense, denial, narrative warfare. He was good at that. Instead, I focused on the system. I reviewed company policy, compliance escalation protocols, whistleblower protections, not as weapons, but as structures. I spoke with legal counsel, not to accuse, but to understand thresholds. What constituted evidence? What is required for corroboration? What triggered mandatory action? Every conversation was framed as hypothetical, detached, professional. The more I learned, the clearer it became. I didn't need to prove malice. I needed to demonstrate process abuse. And the process doesn't care about intent. That realization was grounding. It meant I didn't have to convince anyone of betrayal. I just had to let the system respond to facts. Still, I waited, because timing matters. I observed how Daniel behaved once the last review closed without findings. He relaxed, became more confident, more visible. He believed the worst had passed. And that told me something else. He would repeat the behavior, not out of cruelty, but out of habit. People don't stop using a tool that's worked for them. All I had to do was stop absorbing the impact. I began delegating differently, redirecting inquiries, looping in compliance early, not accusatorily, just procedurally. Daniel noticed again. This time his questions were sharper, less casual. Is everything okay? You seem different lately. I smiled and said I was just being thorough, which was true. The private reveal didn't make me reckless. It made me precise. I wasn't building toward confrontation. I was building toward inevitability. And inevitability doesn't require force. It just requires alignment. When the next anonymous concern surfaced, as I knew it would, I was ready. Not to react, but to step aside and let the system see what it hadn't needed my voice to notice. There comes a moment when gathering stops being preparation and starts becoming avoidance. I reached that moment quietly one morning, staring at an email draft I hadn't sent. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't a report. It was a simple procedural note. One that, if sent, would trigger a different path for everything that followed. I hadn't sent it yet because once I did, there would be no going back to ambiguity. Up until then, I had options. I could confront Daniel privately, lay everything out, demand an explanation, hope for remorse, or at least containment. I could escalate formally, bring everything into compliance at once, force a reckoning. Or I could do nothing, stay silent, protect myself quietly, and let time dissolve the tension. Each option had a cost. Confrontation would satisfy a need for closure, but it would also alert him, give him time to adjust, to erase traces, to reframe. Formal escalation would be effective, but blunt. It would pull others into a conflict they didn't understand yet. It would define me as the source of disruption, regardless of the outcome. Doing nothing would preserve peace, but only temporarily. And it would make me complicit in my own erosion. I sat with that reality longer than I expected, because the decision wasn't about Daniel. It was about who I was willing to be in. I had always believed in fairness, in proportional response, in avoiding unnecessary damage. But I had also learned something important over the past months. Silence, when it only protects others, becomes self-erasure. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want vindication. I wanted alignment. So I chose the option that felt least emotional and most irreversible. I sent the procedural note. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't name names. It didn't accuse anyone of malice. It documented a pattern. It asked for clarification around process integrity. It flagged inconsistencies. It requested a review of anonymous submissions in relation to access controls. Nothing more, nothing less. Once it was sent, I closed my laptop and went for a walk. I didn't feel relief. I felt steadiness. Because the moment you stop trying to manage outcomes, you regain agency. Over the next few weeks, things began to move, but not in ways anyone could point to immediately. Meetings were rescheduled, requests were rerouted, questions began to surface from unexpected directions. Daniel became more careful, more formal, less expansive. He didn't know exactly what had shifted, but he felt it. I watched without satisfaction, because this wasn't about watching someone fall. It was about watching a structure respond to pressure, and pressure reveals fault lines. The decision point wasn't loud. No one noticed it when it happened, but everything after it traced back to that one choice: to stop protecting a narrative that was costing me my integrity. I didn't announce the decision. I let it work. Once the process was in motion, my job wasn't to accelerate it. It was to stay out of its way. I resisted the urge to explain myself, to clarify intentions, to preempt questions that hadn't been asked yet. Doing so would have reinserted me into a narrative I was intentionally stepping back from. Instead, I focused on my work. Not more work, cleaner work. I tightened documentation, standardized handoffs, clarified decision boundaries. All things I should have done earlier, perhaps, but now they served a different purpose. They reduced dependency. And when dependency disappears, so does the illusion of indispensability. Daniel, meanwhile, began to feel the shift without being able to name it. Requests he used to route through me quietly now required formal justification. Conversations he once controlled informally were now shared across teams. Not because I changed the rules, but because I stopped bending them. I noticed how often he'd ask, "Can we just handle this offline?" And how often I'd respond calmly, "Let's loop everyone in." He never objected outright. He couldn't. The system was doing exactly what it was designed to do. Leadership didn't treat me differently during this time. If anything, they seemed more attentive. They asked for my input more deliberately. Not because I spoke louder, but because I spoke less. Silence had sharpened my presence. The next anonymous letter arrived quietly. No announcement, no urgency. But this time, it didn't land the way the others had. Compliance already had context, already had process questions, already had visibility into access logs and submission timing. The letter was noted, then set aside. I wasn't informed immediately. I didn't need to be. The impact showed up elsewhere. Daniel's projects began to stall, not dramatically, but incrementally. Clarifications were requested, justifications were required, assumptions were challenged. Nothing unfair, just scrutiny. And scrutiny, when you're used to operating in narrative space, feels like resistance. I stayed consistent. I didn't gloat. I didn't withdraw. I didn't distance myself from Daniel personally. I treated him the same as always, professionally, neutrally. That neutrality mattered. It denied him the ability to frame me as adversarial. And it denied me the temptation to act from emotion. One afternoon, he asked if we could talk. Just the two of us. I agreed. He spoke carefully, mentioned tension, misalignment, asked if I felt supported. I listened, then said I thought things were fine. Those processes were evolving. That change always felt uncomfortable at first. All true. He searched my face for something. Anger, accusation, confirmation. There was nothing there. And that unsettled him more than confrontation ever could have. Moving in silence isn't about hiding. It's about refusing to perform. I let outcomes speak, and they were beginning to. Consequences rarely announce themselves as punishment. More often, they arrive disguised as absence. That's how it started. Daniel didn't lose authority overnight. No one pulled him aside. No reprimand appeared on his calendar. What changed was subtler and far more destabilizing. People stopped deferring automatically. Questions that once passed without friction now paused mid-air. Requests came back with follow-ups. Meetings ended without clear conclusions, not because decisions couldn't be made, but because no one felt confident making them on narrative alone. I saw it first in the margins. Emails where leadership asked for additional documentation. Agendas that included compliance check-ins by default. Projects that once moved quickly now slowed under the weight of verification. Daniel noticed too. He became more animated in meetings, filling space with explanations that used to suffice on their own. But the room didn't respond the same way. Where there had once been nods, there were now questions. Where there had been trust, there was now curiosity. And curiosity in institutional settings is never neutral. I remained exactly where I had always been. Consistent, measured, unreactive. I didn't step into the vacuum Daniel felt forming around him. I didn't offer to help smooth things over. I didn't reclaim authority. I simply did my work and made sure it was visible in the ways that mattered. That contrast was enough. People began coming to me again. Not loudly, not ceremonially, just quietly, in the way they used to. Can you sanity check this? What's your read on the risk here? Does this align with policy? I answered plainly, without commentary. And slowly the system rebalanced. Daniel started missing things. Nothing catastrophic. Just small oversights that I used to catch without being asked. A compliance nuance, a timing issue, a misaligned assumption. Each one created more reviews, more delay. And delay creates pressure. I saw it in his posture, his pacing, the way he lingered after meetings, as if trying to regain ground that had shifted beneath him. One afternoon, a senior manager asked a question that Daniel couldn't answer definitively. He glanced at me, out of habit, perhaps. I met his eyes, then waited. Not definitely, not performatively, just waited. The manager turned back to Daniel. "We'll need to follow up on that," she said. And for the first time, Daniel didn't have me quietly stabilizing the moment. That was the cost of the role he had assigned me. He had assumed I would always be there, absorbing uncertainty, smoothing edges, carrying weight invisibly. When that stopped, the structure revealed how much it depended on what it never acknowledged. No one blamed him, not yet. But trust, once thinned, doesn't need accusation to fail. It just needs time. I didn't feel triumphant watching this unfold. I felt distance, because by then I wasn't reacting to Daniel anymore. I was watching the system correct itself in slow motion. And systems don't do drama, they do outcomes. There's a moment when someone realizes the ground has shifted, and by then, every attempt to stabilize it only makes the movement more visible. That moment came for Daniel quietly, and then all at once. It started with questions he couldn't answer quickly anymore. Not because he didn't know the work, but because the shortcuts he'd relied on no longer worked. He had grown used to operating in spaces where confidence filled the gaps. Now, the gaps were being examined. He tried to compensate. He scheduled more meetings, added more slides, sent longer emails explaining the context that once lived comfortably between the lines. He used words like alignment and shared understanding more frequently, as if saying them could recreate what had already thinned. But the system wasn't listening to tone anymore. It was listening to the structure. One afternoon, leadership asked for a retrospective on a decision made months earlier, one that had been referenced in an anonymous concern. They wanted documentation. Not because they suspected wrongdoing, but because the process trail was incomplete. Daniel volunteered to walk them through it. I watched as he spoke, carefully, confidently, the way he always had. But this time, someone interrupted him. Can we see where that was documented? And who signed off on this step? Why wasn't compliance looped in here? Each question was reasonable. Each one chipped away at the narrative he'd been maintaining. I was copied on the follow-up thread. Not as the subject, but as a reference point. They wanted to confirm what the process should have been. I responded with policy excerpts, timelines, neutral clarification, no commentary. The contrast was unmistakable. Daniel began reaching out to me more directly again, asking for input, for alignment, for reassurance. Not overtly. He still framed it as collaboration, but there was urgency now, a subtle edge. Can you help me make sense of what they're asking for? Do you remember how we handled this part? Am I missing something here? I helped where appropriate. I answered honestly, but I didn't reconstruct narratives for him. And that's when it became clear to him, if not consciously, then viscerally, that the old dynamic was gone. He couldn't fix it by talking. He couldn't smooth it over. He couldn't redirect attention because the system wasn't broken. It was finally seeing clearly. The last attempt came in the form of a private conversation. He asked if we could reset, start fresh. He said things felt off lately. That may have been stress that caused misunderstandings. I listened, then I said something simple. I think the processes are just catching up to the complexity of the work. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't a denial. It was a boundary. He nodded, but his eyes searched my face again, looking for something he could respond to. There was nothing. After that, the pace of events accelerated, not because anyone pushed, but because there was no longer resistance. Compliance completed a broader review of anonymous submissions across departments. Access logs were audited, patterns were flagged. I wasn't asked to participate beyond providing factual information, and that, more than anything, told me it was over. Because when the system no longer needs your narrative, it has already made its decision. Daniel didn't panic publicly. He didn't explode. He grew quieter, more contained. Too late. The role he had assigned me, reliable, silent, absorbing, was gone. And without it, there was nothing left to hide behind. The confrontation didn't happen in a boardroom. There was no raised voice, no dramatic reveal. It happened in a hallway, late in the afternoon, when most people had already left. Daniel caught up to me near the elevators. He looked tired. Not frantic, not angry, just tired in the way people do when they've run out of angles. "Stephen," he said, "can we talk for a minute?" I nodded. We stepped into an empty meeting room. The lights were dimmed automatically and the city reflected faintly in the glass. It felt neutral, appropriate. He didn't start with accusations. He started with familiarity. "We've worked together a long time," he said. "I feel like things have changed and I don't fully understand why." I listened without interrupting. He spoke about pressure, about expectations, about how hard it is to manage perception at higher levels. He framed everything as a shared experience. At one point, he said, "I hope you know I've always had your back." That was when I finally spoke. "I know," I said. "You've always been very aware of how things look." He paused. It wasn't a trap. It wasn't even a challenge, just a statement. He studied my face, searching again for emotion he could engage with. There was none. "I never meant to put you in a difficult position," he said carefully. "I know," I replied. That answer unsettled him more than disagreement would have. I didn't list evidence, I didn't reference letters, I didn't explain timelines, because this wasn't a trial. It was an ending. "I think," I continued, "that when systems start asking questions, it's usually because they need clearer inputs." He nodded slowly. "And I think," I added, "it's better to let them work." Silence settled between us. Not tense, just final. He didn't deny anything. He didn't confess. He didn't need to. Because the point of confrontation isn't always resolution. Sometimes it's alignment. He understood that I knew. And I understood that he knew I wasn't going to protect the old dynamic anymore. We walked out separately. No handshake, no hostility, just a clean break in how we occupied the same space. That was enough. What surprised me most after everything settled wasn't the relief. It was the quiet recalibration. I didn't feel lighter because a threat was gone. I felt clearer because I no longer had to manage a distortion. For a long time, I had confused professionalism with self-erasure. I believed that being ethical meant being absorbent, taking on ambiguity so others could move faster. That belief had made me useful, but it had also made me available in ways I hadn't examined. When the system finally corrected itself, nothing about my role changed on paper. Same title, same responsibilities, same desk. But the way I inhabited that role was different. I spoke when it mattered. I documented without apology. I declined to fill gaps that weren't mine to fill. And people adjusted. Not because they were told to, but because clarity is easier to work with than assumption. Leadership began asking me questions again. Not out of obligation, but because they trusted the precision of my answers. My work became a reference point rather than a support function. I didn't seek visibility. I allowed it. That distinction matters. As for Daniel, he eventually moved on. There was no public fallout. No explanation was given to the wider team. Just a quiet transition framed as a new opportunity. I felt no satisfaction in that, only closure. Because justice in real life is rarely about spectacle. It's about alignment between action and consequence, between role and responsibility. The experience changed how I see trust. I no longer assume it. I don't withhold it either. I observe it. Trust isn't something you grant once. It's something you verify continuously through behavior. And silence, when chosen consciously, isn't weakness. It's discipline. I still carry that old leather notebook. I don't use it as often anymore. But it reminds me of something important. You don't need to outmaneuver people to protect yourself. You just need to stop holding structures together that were never designed to carry you fairly. Who I am now isn't harder or colder, just clearer. Looking back, the most important lesson from this story isn't about betrayal. It's about participation. For a long time, I believed that staying quiet was the same as staying ethical. That by not escalating, not accusing, not asserting myself, I was preserving integrity. What I didn't realize was that silence, when it only flows in one direction, becomes a form of consent. Not consent to wrongdoing, but consent to distortion. The anonymous letters didn't harm me because they were false. They harmed me because they landed in a context where my voice had already been softened by habit, where my restraint had been misread as absence. And that's the part that matters. Most professional damage doesn't come from overt attacks. It comes from small, repeated misalignments that go uncorrected because they don't feel worth the trouble. But trouble doesn't need to feel dramatic to be consequential. This story isn't an argument for confrontation. I still believe most conflicts don't require it, nor is it a call to become suspicious or guarded. It's a reminder that boundaries don't always look like resistance. Sometimes they look like documentation. Sometimes they look like refusing to explain what's already clear. Sometimes they look like letting systems function without cushioning their flaws. Quiet dominance isn't about winning. It's about withdrawing your labor from narratives that don't serve the truth. Once I did that, everything else followed naturally. Not quickly, not cleanly, but inevitably. I didn't have to expose anyone. I didn't have to demand acknowledgement. I didn't have to rewrite the past. I just stopped participating in a version of myself that made other people comfortable at my expense. And that was enough. If there's one thing I hope you take from this, it's this. Pay attention to the roles you accept by default, especially the ones that feel harmless. Because over time, those roles can become cages, ones you don't notice until someone else starts using them. Before we end, I want to leave you with a question, not as a lesson, but as an invitation. Have you ever looked back and realized that staying quiet wasn't protecting the peace? It was protecting a pattern. If so, I'd be curious to hear how you recognized it and what changed when you did.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.